A History of Pandemics. Part 1. Disease. It's a terrifying prospect, but it has been part of human culture and of all life since the dawn of time. After all, bacteria evolved 3.5 billion years ago, and viruses 1.5 billion years ago, while we modern humans have only been around for 130,000 years. A myriad of infectious pathogens perpetually surround us, causing severe, mild, or even no reaction at all, depending on your health, immunity, and sometimes sheer luck. But when one of these diseases spreads rapidly, infecting thousands, it becomes an epidemic. And when it crosses borders to infect populations in multiple countries and across continents, you have a pandemic. Epidemics and pandemics have occurred countless times in the past, infecting, injuring, and killing millions. They have changed many lives and the course of human history in countless ways. But in the end, humanity has always continued to move forward. And in many cases, we have learned from these outbreaks to develop new techniques of treatment and prevention. Additionally, we have made massive strides forward in sanitation, hygiene, and nutrition, making the human population healthier and less vulnerable to illness than ever before. Let's look back at some of the worst diseases and pandemics in history. Smallpox. The viruses variola major and variola minor have been hitting humanity hard in devastating waves for most of human history. Smallpox has caused more suffering and death than any other disease. The virus is believed to have arisen in Northeast Africa about 10,000 years ago. It has been found in Egyptian mummies from 3,000 years ago, including Pharaoh Ramses V. Smallpox is mentioned in medical writings from ancient India and China in the same millennium, and killed at least 3 Chinese and 2 Japanese emperors. The virus is spread through the air via the coughing and sneezing of the infected, and causes fever, vomiting, mouth sores, and fluid-filled blisters all over the body. It was fatal in about 30% of its victims, and those who survived were left scarred and disfigured by pockmarks and sometimes blinded. There are 7 known religious deities dedicated specifically to smallpox and protecting people from it, including Sapona in West Africa and Shitala Mata among the Hindus. In 1022 AD, a Buddhist nun in the Sichuan region of China noticed that those who survived smallpox were never reinfected. She ground up smallpox scabs and blew the powder up the noses of healthy people. And her unusual treatment worked. She had invented viriolation. Those she inoculated died only 3% of the time. Not ideal, but far better than the 30% mortality rate of the full-blown disease. Knowledge of this life-saving treatment spread very slowly and was never able to outpace the infection, which had a habit of fading out and reappearing in lethal outbreaks around the world. Through most of the last 3,000 years, you had about a 1 in 3 chance of contracting smallpox in your lifetime. Unfortunately, we will be hearing much more from the terrible smallpox virus as we travel through history. The Antonine Plague. This scourge first appeared among Roman soldiers as they held the city of Seleucia in modern-day Iraq under siege during the winter of 165 AD. From there, it spread through the army and around the Roman Empire. Symptoms included fever, swelling of the throat, diarrhea, and skin eruptions. The underlying disease may have been smallpox or measles, both of which are airborne and spread by coughing and sneezing. At the height of the outbreak, 2,000 people a day were dying, totaling 5 million people, about 25% of the Roman Empire's population. In the midst of the fear and chaos, many turned to magic for protection. Amulets were popular, and incantations were written above doorways to safeguard those who dwelt within. Among the victims was the emperor himself, Lucius Verus. The plague was named after his co-ruler, Marcus Aurelius Antonius. Due in great part to the ravages of the plague, Marcus Aurelius's reign marked the end of the golden age known as Pax Romana, or Roman peace. The pestilence demoralized the population that had grown used to prosperity and stability, and the Roman Empire never fully recovered. The Plague of Justinian. 4 centuries later, and the Roman Empire had fallen, making way for the Byzantine Empire to dominate the Mediterranean. In 541, the area was once again slammed by a devastating disease, the first recorded pandemic of the bubonic plague, which would ravage Eurasia repeatedly for centuries. This outbreak is thought to have originated in the Tian Shan mountain ranges along the northwestern border of China. In this area, fleas carrying Bacterium Yersinia pestis infected the nomadic Hun people, who frequently traded with and raided parts of the Roman and Byzantine empires. It is believed that the plague reached Egypt, where it was carried by flea-infested rats on board grain ships across the sea to Constantinople, the capital city of the empire. There, large stores of grain were collected and held to feed the empire. Rats thrived in the granaries, multiplying themselves and the plague, which quickly spread among the human population. Symptoms included chills, malaise, fever, muscle cramps, seizures, gangrene of the toes, fingers, lips, and nose, and the most distinct symptom, painful lymph gland swellings called buboes in the neck, armpits, and groin. Those infected with bubonic plague had an 80% mortality rate, and death came on very quickly within 10 days of initial infection. The plague could also become airborne, causing lung infection known as pneumonic plague, which increased the death rate to 90%, and in rare cases the bacteria could infect the blood, becoming septicemic plague, which was fatal in almost all cases within 24 hours of contraction. 5,000 people per day died in Constantinople, totaling 40% of the city's population. Farmers in the countryside died en masse and left their fields fallow, causing the price of grain to skyrocket and famine to ensue. And there weren't enough laborers left alive to keep the empire running as usual. Many blamed the plague on the emperor, Justinian, calling him a demon. He himself contracted the disease but survived. Others blamed his wife, Empress Theodora, saying this was punishment from God for her promiscuity. While probably not a demon, Justinian had overstretched the empire's funds with the construction of great churches, including the Hagia Sophia, and on wars of expansion. When the Justinian plague struck, it crippled the economy and the army, halting the growth and stability of the empire. Justinian moved quickly to enact new legislation to deal with the glut of inheritance cases, but he was powerless to preserve the peace. The social and economic impact of the plague was widespread throughout Europe. With the Byzantine army no longer keeping them in check, many other groups were able to expand and conquer, including the Anglo-Saxons who first settled in the British Isles during this time. The Black Death. Some 800 years later, in the mid-1300s, the bubonic plague returned once more to decimate Europe and Asia. Climate change in Central Asia in 1338 caused rodents to flee dried-out grasslands and move into areas populated by humans, where the fleas they carried spread the disease. The plague was then carried by traders along the Silk Road, where it devastated every place it went. India and Mongolia were left depopulated, and the Middle East was covered in dead bodies. By 1343, the pestilence reached Crimea. There, the Mongol army had the city of Kaffa under siege. When Mongol soldiers died, their corpses were catapulted over the city walls in order to infect the people cowering within. Genoese traders jumped in their ships to escape the war and death in Kaffa, but they unwittingly carried deadly rats with them back home to Italy. From there, the disease launched its carnage of Europe, spreading north like wildfire. The population, already weakened by malnutrition, war, and other diseases, was massacred. The Black Death is estimated to have killed around 100 million people, between 30 and 60% of Europe's population, making this the most deadly pandemic in history. Infection and death were so rampant that corpses filled the streets as graveyards reached capacity and there was no one left to bury the dead. At least half of the populations of Paris and London perished. Smaller communities attempted to isolate themselves to protect against the scourge, with varying degrees of success. The word quarantine emerged in Venice, referring to the 40 days ships were required to wait in the harbor before docking to ensure that no one aboard was carrying the plague. Many turned to God to save them in the already deeply religious era, and faith and obsession with death and the afterlife dominated culture and thought for centuries to come. The Flagellants, a group of militant pilgrims, emerged primarily in Germany and Italy. They beat and whipped themselves publicly in punishment for the sins of humanity. When the Black Death finally ebbed after the better part of a decade, those who survived faced a very changed world. Peasants found there was more demand for labor than there were people to do it. They abandoned the feudal lands that their families had been enslaved to for centuries, in search of better pay, and many of them got it, becoming wealthier than ever before. This infuriated the nobles, who saw themselves as inherently superior, so they imposed laws limiting everything from where peasants could live to what types of clothes they could wear. Peasants revolted, and thus began centuries of class warfare that would eventually culminate in the end of feudalism in Europe. Kokolizli. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and in epidemiology this is especially true. Those who contract an infection, mild or serious, will in most cases build an immunity to it. So if you survive and are exposed to the same pathogen again, your immune system will know how to fight back, and you will likely never become ill again. Until Christopher Columbus landed in the Americas in 1492, the people living there had their own diseases and their own immunities to them. Their immune systems were not prepared for the onslaught of new infections carried across the sea by Europeans. In the mid-16th century, an unknown pathogen was introduced by Spanish conquistadors, which obliterated much of the population of the Aztec Empire in modern-day Mexico. The viral hemorrhagic fever known as Kokolizli was likely related to the Ebola virus. Its symptoms included a black tongue, bloody diarrhea, neurological disorders, and bleeding from the nose, eyes, and mouth. An estimated 5 to 15 million people died, and many Aztec villages and cities were left abandoned. Spaniards saw the disproportionate infection of the Aztecs as God's punishment for their heathenism, but little record survives as to what the Aztec people made of this horror inflicted upon them. The massive loss of life did more to make way for the Spanish conquest than swords and muskets ever could. Conquistadors took advantage and claimed much of the land left abandoned by the Aztec people, ensuring the downfall of their empire. Smallpox. Again, Kokolizli was certainly not the only disease Europeans shared with the inhabitants of the Americas. Smallpox was introduced to the Caribbean island of Hispaniola in 1509 and spread to mainland North America in the following year. Because the indigenous population had no acquired immunity, the disease wiped out thousands with an 80 to 90% mortality rate. As with the Aztecs, disease paved the way for Europeans to colonize North America, and the infection of Native Americans wasn't always accidental. In 1763, during the French and Indian War, the British Army intentionally gave blankets which had touched the sores of smallpox victims to local tribe members in an act of biological warfare. But Europeans didn't get away from smallpox scot-free. For the better part of the 18th century, it was the leading cause of death worldwide. An estimated 400,000 Europeans died each year, and 1 in 10 infants in Northern Europe would die of the disease before reaching their first birthday. This terrible pestilence did not discriminate between classes. It killed Queen Mary II of England, her husband King William III, and her sister Queen Anne, as well as King Louis I of Spain and King Louis XV of France. George Washington survived a bout of smallpox in his early 20s, and Abraham Lincoln was in the early stages of the disease when he delivered the Gettysburg Address. Smallpox infected and scarred Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresa and several of her 16 children, killing 4 of them. The Empress decided to have all of her children inoculated against the disease, popularizing the life-saving technique of viriolation, which was first invented in ancient China. At this time, doctors would take pus from an infected person's skin and use it to scratch the skin of a healthy person. 3% of those inoculated still died of the disease, but this was a big improvement on the 30% who died from actual smallpox. In the 1790s, English physician Edward Jenner observed that dairymaids didn't get smallpox. He realized that this was because they had already been infected with cowpox, a virus that is related but significantly less severe and almost never deadly. He tested his theory by inoculating his gardener's 8-year-old son with pus from a cowpox sore. The boy had fever for a few days and then recovered. Jenner then inoculated him with actual smallpox and no symptoms developed. After more testing and significant skepticism and eventual acceptance by the medical community, Jenner's new vaccination replaced the more risky variolation. After widespread vaccination campaigns throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the World Health Organization certified smallpox, the most deadly disease in human history, as eradicated in 1979. Jenner is remembered as the father of immunology, and the basic tenets of his technique are still used today when creating new vaccines against new diseases. The world no longer has to worry about the threat of smallpox.
Top 10 deadliest virus in the world. The virus was discovered 12,000 years ago during the Neolithic period, but it is not as widespread as it is today. Nowadays, as people are constantly relocating, accommodation and advancements are causing the virus to spread and develop, and the virus is even more fierce. Out of the millions of viruses, some of them are deadly and have killed millions and spread across the globe. 10. H5N1 bird flu virus. H5N1 virus, also known as bird flu, is a bird flu virus. It first infected humans in 1997. The mortality rate for each infection is 60%. The virus has other flu-like symptoms such as fever, vomiting, diarrhea, and respiratory problems such as pneumonia. 9. Lujo virus. The Lujo virus was named after the first two characters of Lusaka, Zambia, and Johannesburg, South Africa, which first spread in 2008. The virus causes 80% of deaths. The virus is known to have symptoms similar to Ebola, which include blood, gums, and nose blood. 8. Herpes B virus. Herpes B virus is known to be a virus transmitted by humans to macaque, which can cause up to 80% of life-threatening infections. It was first discovered in 1932, a virus that causes neurological problems and can be fatal if left untreated. 7. Dengue virus. Dengue is a virus that infects people from the mosquitoes and can cause an estimated 20 to 30% life-threatening injury if not treated properly. The first symptoms include headache, dizziness, nausea, fever, and blood flow to the gums and nose. Each year, between 10,000 and 20,000 people die, and an estimated 50 million to 500 million people contract the disease. Dengue is also associated with the Zika virus, a disease affecting pregnant women and developing fetuses. 6. Rabies virus. Rabies, caused by the rabies virus, spreads to humans through the saliva of an animal that bites the human body, causing nerve damage and loss of consciousness. Most of these infections are caused by animals such as dogs, most prevalent, cats, bats, monkeys, and scars, which carry the virus and can be 100% fatal if not vaccinated immediately. The animals bite during the week. 5. H1N1 virus. The H1N1 virus, also known as the Spanish flu, first started in 1918 and has claimed the lives of 50 million people. More than World War I, the disease has spread to the United States and most severely in Spain, until it is named the Spanish flu. H1N1 is also associated with a number of smallpox-related diseases, such as Spanish flu, Russian flu, Asian flu and swine flu. 4. Ebola virus. The Ebola virus was first discovered near the Ebola River in Zaire in 1976, which is also 90% fatal, if not treated promptly. The virus can cause fatigue, fever, headache, joint and muscle pain, and even cause vomiting, diarrhea and bloody diarrhea. Three. Smallpox virus. Smallpox is the deadliest virus in history, with 200 million to 500 million lives worldwide. The virus was first discovered more than 10,000 years before Christ. It is also known that the virus can cause fever, pain, and blisters all over the body, causing a 95% higher risk of death. But the virus has now been completely eradicated. 2. Marburg virus. Marburg virus causes a fatality rate of 23% to 90% if left untreated. People infected with this disease die from bleeding or loss of blood. The disease was first discovered in 1967 in laboratories in Frankfurt and Marburg, Germany. 1. HIV. HIV is a deadly virus that kills millions of people each year. People who carry the virus have a mortality rate of 80% to 90%. The virus attacks humans by weakening the immune system and exposing them to infections, especially respiratory diseases such as tuberculosis and pneumonia. People who are healthy may live longer, but those who are weak will die sooner.
Coronaviruses are a family of contagious viruses that can cause respiratory infections from the common cold to SARS. These viruses can mutate rapidly, resulting in the 2019 new coronavirus named SARS coronavirus 2, which has crown-like spikes that characterize the family. As with most viruses, SARS coronavirus 2 commonly spreads from an infected person to others through droplets in the air when coughing and sneezing, through close personal contact, or by touching a contaminated surface and then touching the face. Unless controlled, each infection typically results in 2 to 3 subsequent people being infected. Like other coronaviruses, SARS coronavirus 2 deposits its genetic material into host cells. The viral RNA reaches host elements called ribosomes, which act as factories that produce viral proteins. This facilitates replication of the viral genome and assembly of viral components, producing fully formed replicants that are secreted and further spread infection. Infection caused by SARS coronavirus 2 is known as COVID-19 and can cause fever, coughing and breathing difficulties, along with cold-like symptoms. Serious cases of COVID-19 can cause pneumonia, severe acute respiratory syndrome, kidney failure, and can lead to fatalities. Global health organizations have outlined preventive measures to reduce the chances of SARS coronavirus 2 infection, including refraining from touching the face with unclean hands and frequent hand washing with soapy water. As with previous global outbreaks such as swine flu, COVID-19 has gained global attention and treatment development is being accelerated.
My name is Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong, and I'm here today to present to you the science behind the coronavirus. I really think it's really important for us to present some of the science because it's very clear to me that there's a lot of fear out there, and what adds to the fear is confusion. But if we could present the science and really try and understand not only how does this coronavirus work, how does it infect the body, what does it do, and how we can actually attack it, we have an opportunity to really provide some peace of mind, some level of control in the hands not of every individual, but the entire community. I'm really excited by the fact that this coronavirus has attacked us in 2003, and we have the benefit of that insight and scientific knowledge. But we also today have tools that we didn't have then. We have more genomics, we have more bioinformatics, we have supercomputing. And together with those tools, I think we have a real shot at not only defeating this virus, but overcoming this pandemic. So in order for me to take you through this complex story of this coronavirus today, we will talk about how do we understand this virus? How does the virus infect your body? And more importantly, explain the symptoms that are associated with this infection. What can we do to control and prevent its spread? And excitingly, what is on the horizon that the entire world scientists as a community are working together to cure this infection and preventing us from getting this in the first place? There are some questions we won't be able to fully answer yet, is how long is this pandemic, will this pandemic last? I think it's important that this 1 hour special will have a separate, maybe a slightly different lens. While the world is working on very significantly on how to kill the virus, we want to take this lens of what does this virus do to your body, i.e. the host, and how can we prevent it getting into your body, into the cells? How can we actually treat the host or the patient to prevent it becoming a severe fatal disease? So while on the one hand, we were working hard to develop a vaccine, and I think it's important and realistically important for us to identify a treatment now for those that are severely ill. Let me start on what is the coronavirus. You've seen a lot of names: coronavirus, COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, SARS, and they all in essence mean the exact same thing here. This virus is a RNA virus. What I mean by that, the genetic signature inside this virus, that little curly, is made of a RNA that can reproduce. But most importantly, the virus has on its surface an envelope or a capsule. And then you see the spikes. And the spikes form a crown, and that's why it's called coronavirus. In 2019, it created this disease in China, and that's what COVID-19 was the first name. Coronavirus disease in 2019, COVID-19. And now the World Health Organization has created an official name. This is the latest scientific name, SARS-CoV-2. And why SARS-CoV-2? Because this is a second generation daughter virus of SARS. And why is that important to us? Well, it's given us a head start. It's given the scientists a head start since 2003, 2004, 2005 to fully understand this family of coronaviruses, specifically SARS and now SARS-CoV-2. What's exciting about that is we now have in our fingertips supercomputing, genomics, bioinformatics that wasn't as advanced even in 2003. And this is now allowing us to understand how contagious is this coronavirus. Because sadly, this mutation has allowed SARS-CoV-2 to become 1,000 times more infective than that of SARS. And that is the fear. The fear is SARS was an endemic, limited in its scale and scope, but now SARS-CoV-2 is a pandemic. So the question that we need to understand is, how does this enter your body? What does this do? How does it infect the cell? How does it affect the lung? And what organs does it affect? I think this is an opportunity for us to take a different lens of understanding the host effects rather than just the virus itself. And if we look at that host effects, we now truly have a shot at trying to block it and block the ability to get to SARS. So firstly is an infected person has the ability to contaminate 2.6 other patients. And how does that happen? Well, it's droplets, and this nanoparticle of a virus forms droplets, and these droplets can go on surfaces and then go into your hand. The important fact is that your hand is now a vector. We'll come back to how we can use that fact to our advantage and kill the virus. But the lungs, what happens inside the cell? Well, this virus has now hijacked this receptor in our body called the ACE2 receptor. This receptor is on blood vessels, this receptor is on kidney and even on heart, but most importantly on what we call the alveolar cells of the lung. It's in a very important receptor called ACE2 because it's there in your body to protect your lung tissue from injury. What has happened is this virus, through its spikes, has figured out a way to interact with that receptor and use that receptor to dock. The virus goes on now to take advantage of the cell itself and use the cell as a factory. It's now taken on what we call taking the RNA inside the virus itself. It breaks it up and remarkably takes what we call the Golgi apparatus, the machinery of the human cell, to reproduce itself and repackage. And in so doing, it propagates. So this is the issue of how the virus actually regenerates and sheds. Now we are full circle because that shedding of that positively charged patient has the ability to contaminate others. And the opportunity, however, to stop, not just unfortunately the shedding, but stop that propagation is what containment is all about. Not only is this virus highly contagious, but it is also deadly. And this is the map or the results that the Chinese have put out with regard to the pattern of disease progression in China. And there are three types of symptoms or patients: the mild, moderate, severe, and critical. And what you see from this is the patients that are severe and critical progress very rapidly to the intensive care unit and rapidly to death. This can happen as rapidly as 3 to 4 weeks. But it doesn't exclude the patients who are mild or moderate. While rare, it doesn't exclude them. And this chart, again, of 44,000 cases in mainland China has separated the fatality as it relates to age. And as one could see from this chart, the yellow is that greater than 80 and 70 to 79 and 60 to 69 are the predominant patients who die from this disease. But unfortunately, there are deaths in patients who are 40 to 49, 30 to 39, 20 to 29, and even 10 to 19. So while it's certainly the majority of patients have mild symptoms, the young aren't protected yet from this fatality rate. And why does this happen? Well, the way this virus works is as it replicates and it becomes, overtakes this protective ACE2 receptor, fibrosis occurs, meaning scarring, and that's why 100% of these patients who have fatalities have this ground glass effect in their lungs, and there's no longer any oxygenation. The body tries to take this over. Sadly, we end up then with what we call SARS, which is severe acute respiratory syndrome, in which, in essence, it is impossible for the body to get enough oxygen to the rest of the organs, and we have what we call multi-organ failure. This happens, unfortunately, not only mainly in the elderly, but also those with pre-existing conditions. And as you could see, patients with cardiovascular disease, diabetes, respiratory disease, and high blood pressure have this pre-existing conditions or are prone, if they get infected, to end up with SARS. We are now learning on a day-by-day basis what are the clinical effects of SARS. we are understanding and beginning to sort of see hypertension, severe hypertension, cardiac failure, and even a very interesting finding of low potassium in the blood. So the Chinese, again, are putting out this data in rapid fashion and allowing clinicians and people who are looking after such patients to find ways to combat the SARS. It is also important for us to understand these are the patients who will require ICU. And we'll talk a little bit again about flattening the curve. We really have an opportunity as an entire community and as a country to not only flatten the curve, but not overwhelm the healthcare system so that the ICUs and this medical staff can be available to treat these patients, not only with these pre-existing conditions, but to take a patient from critical and severe all the way back to moderate and mild. It is important for all of us to understand the ability for this virus to spread and how it does so. It has a spreading factor of about 2.6, and what does that mean? The New York Times has put together a video that I think beautifully explains the real contagious capability of this virus. Let's imagine there were 5 people who are sick, and one cycle meaning it's within this 5 people. Well, if there is an infection rate of 2.6, and that's mathematically, we call it exponential, what would happen within 2 cycles, that would become 18 people who are sick. 3 cycles, 52 people are sick. 4 cycles, 140 people are sick. And after 5 cycles, we have over 300 people that are sick. This is what we mean by isolating people that are infected. This was, by the way, the value of the test. The purpose of isolating people who are sick is to flatten the curve. What we mean by that is if we can identify these patients that are ill, we can actually, with protective measures or with isolation, flatten the curve. And the importance of flattening that curve is we can protect the healthcare system's capacity so that we can actually have sufficient ICUs, sufficient medical personnel, sufficient medical supplies to deal with the inevitable, sadly inevitable, severe and critically ill patients who may die from this disease. So it's beholden to all of us to work together to identify those patients or yourselves or your family members or your friends of visitors from overseas who may have the symptoms of this disease and either self-isolate even without a test, because it's critical for all of us to create the extinction of this virus by self-isolating and allowing then the healthcare system to manage with the very ill patient. If we have to self-isolate or have patients isolate so they prevent this exponential growth of this pandemic, we need to understand what are the symptoms, even without a test. So this is the issue. We can, and through the experience again of the Chinese, understand how do we recognize at least an infection. We need to know who's most vulnerable, are men more at risk, are children at risk. We need to ask the question, how long does the virus stay in your body? With regard to the last question, disturbingly, there's now some reports that the virus can stay in your body for more than 30 days. So the first question then is to recognize either yourself, your friend, your family member that has an infection. And this is a report, again, from the Chinese experience of over thousands of cases. And here is Wuhan City, Hubei province, and the country as a whole, where the Chinese rapidly got out the information that fever and cough, a dry cough, are some of the hallmarks of this infection. So anybody with a fever or dry cough should suspect, without a test even, and go to the extent of self-isolating and prevent then this contamination either amongst their family members, their friends, and their co-workers. What's of concern, however, is what percentage are severe or critical. I think the good news is that 81% of symptoms are mild, but the concern is in patients with pre-existing conditions in the elderly. If you take again this case report now, 44,000 confirmed cases in mainland China, you see from their experience, patients who require hospitalization, they call that severe or critical in intensive care. If you add those together, that represents 18%. So if you then extrapolate what potentially could happen in our country and the number of patients that could get infected, and then say 18% of such patients will require hospitalization or intensive care units, that means we need sufficient beds. That means we need sufficient ICU personnel. That means we need to preserve at all costs the resources of the healthcare system. That is why I can emphasize so much that we need to flatten this curve and not generate this peak. Because if we generate this peak and 18% are severely or critically ill, there is no way our country, our system, has the capacity to manage that onslaught, or what I call this tsunami. However, it's in our control. I'm going to talk a little bit about the science of soap. Simple things like the science of soap and the power of soap. This idea of washing your hands that you're told as a kindergarten days is not trivial as it relates to this disease. It's not trivial as it relates to not overwhelming the healthcare system. And it's not trivial in terms of exponentially spreading this disease. The purpose of this presentation was not only to try and allay fears, but also to provide information that we as a community and as a nation can actually control. So I really feel it was important for me to speak about the science of soap, because we can not only control, we can prevent the spread. I'll speak a little bit about how long does the viruses last on the surfaces, with the surfaces of your hand or surfaces of your computer, your phone, and how we can do containment. Lessons we could learn from China, and then we'll speak a little bit about the role of testing, lessons we can learn from Korea. I recognize that we are in a little bit of a bind because of the lack of testing. But I think what we can do now is understand that perhaps even without testing, we can now control and prevent the spread. So let me speak about the science of soap. The viruses are not bacteria. So antibacterial soap is a myth as it relates to killing the viruses, because it has this fatty, greasy layer on its as an envelope, loves getting onto surfaces to which it will adhere, such as your hand. So your hand is a vector. But if you took this vector of the hand and understood the science of soap, where the virus has this fatty layer and the skin is the surface, detergent, straightforward regular detergent, dishwasher fluid, hair shampoo, detergent, soap, acts as a surfactant. What does that mean? It actually goes and orientates itself, these soap particles, towards the fatty layer of the virus. And in so doing, it actually orientates and lifts off these viruses and creates this clean surface. So we have the ability to understand that the science of soap, its natural ability to act as a detergent, the reason why you need at least 20 seconds, because your hands have nooks and crannies. You need the detergent to enter onto and create this interaction with the virus. You then need to rub and wash because you need it to be lifted from the surfaces. However, what's exciting about this virus is because it is an envelope virus. And that, by the way, is its Achilles heel. Because what does the soap do? The soap has an ability to crack that envelope. And if it cracks that envelope, you're able to kill that virus. So each one of us has the ability to be washing your hands and cracking that envelope and preventing the spread. This is the power and the science of soap. What have we learned from Korea? Well, it turns out to prevent the overwhelming of the healthcare system, and in fact to protect healthcare workers, one can do drive-by testing. And I think this is a national initiative which we should take on and learn this experience from Korea. What have we learned from China? China has taken the draconian step of containment. We are unfortunately beyond that point now. And so we are now left then, therefore, with the opportunity to control it, at least within your control, of actually taking on the power and the science of soap. The question is always asked, what is the hope for a cure today? And also, what can we do to prevent infection in the first place? Well, as we talked about what we can do to prevent infection in the first place is this issue of self-containment, washing your hands, the power of soap. And frankly, one of the most important things is the elbow bump. Stop doing handshaking. The issue of the cure is a complex issue because we have to talk about what is the difference between a treatment for those that are ill versus what is a vaccine that'll prevent the infection from happening. And I'll try and address that. I'll try and explain the difference between a treatment and a vaccine. But I think we also would like to discuss what new treatments are being developed today. And I'm excited to say that the entire world community of scientists and pharmaceutical companies and biotechnology companies are frantically working 24/7 to find new treatments that are being developed. I'll have to address with scientific vigor about how long will a vaccine take to develop. But I think of great concern is what is our manufacturing capacity should we need some of these vaccines or these treatments urgently. So let's start. The first question is, how long will it take to develop a treatment or vaccine? First, let's even talk about what's the difference between a treatment versus a vaccine, because I think there's a lot of confusion around there. A vaccine is like that what you have for flu. We create a shot, a subcutaneous shot, and using a vector, sometimes a common cold vector, or what we call an adenovirus, in which we put the sequence of this SARS-CoV-2 into this to train and educate your body to recognize this virus and have readily available killer cells to prevent you getting infected. That's a vaccine. Unfortunately, that'll take a while to develop because testing needs to be done about the effectiveness of that vaccine in giving you true protection. On the other hand, we have patients that are ill, critically ill, mildly ill, that we can take a patient that is mildly ill and prevent it from becoming critically ill. We can take a patient that's critically ill from becoming severely to the point of fatally ill, and to understand how we can do that. I think treatment for these kinds of patients are much closer at hand. This virus works by hijacking a receptor in your body. It takes this receptor, uses the machinery of the lung, and actually replicates and infects the lung to the point of fibrosis and death. Worse, this virus has found a way to evade the immune system. It's found a way to actually kill the natural killer cells in your body, the T cells in your body. From the data again from China, what we've discovered is that the patients who die, not only are they elderly, but they have a low natural killer cell and T cell count. So we're beginning to understand this complex biology of this virus. And that's why I'm saying we're looking at it from a perspective not about the virus, but the host. So if we could understand the host's reaction and create counter reactions to this, we have a shot for treatment. So let me speak a little bit about treatment. There are multiple strategies. The first strategy is to take this concept that the virus has hijacked this receptor in our human body called the ACE. So this ACE receptor is the first port of entry. So if we could block the entry of this virus through this ACE receptor, we could block the entire cascade of its ability to use the engine and the machinery to regenerate. Well, happily and luckily, we now have scientists, and this is as recently as this month, understanding this ACE receptor through the power of genomics, through the power of supercomputing, through the power of protein folding. This complex receptor in our human body is now being able to understood. And because we can understand this receptor, we can find systems to create decoys and sponges so that this receptor cannot be attacked, so that the virus can be, as a Trojan horse, blocked from entering this. This complex science is now being attacked worldwide by scientists around the world, and is a very exciting strategy. The other strategy is to say, could we block the machinery? And the answer to that is yes, because we now understand how this virus replicates. The third strategy is, could we block what we call the endosomal packaging and block that? And what's exciting is we've now discovered potentially, and I say this potentially because science is not fully borne out, and this is an experience in China, that old drugs repurposed can actually block these packaging systems inside the cell of the human cell and ameliorate this disease. And a fourth strategy is to actually kill the factory of the virus itself. It turns out the way this virus works, it has found a way to kill the natural killer cells and T cells of the human body. From the results we've seen from China in the patients who had a fatal outcome in the elderly, the lymphocytes, or what we call the natural killer cells and T cells, are depleted, significantly depleted. Whether that's an effect of the virus or whether the patients are immunosuppressed or had pre-existing conditions, including cancer, it's not clear yet. But what is important and is clear is that these natural killer cells or T cells are depleted. However, we have in our innate system the ability to kill infected cells. So a very interesting strategy is to activate these natural killer cells that, as you could see from this diagram, has an ability to identify, lock on to, and really push what they call granzymes into these cells and destroy them. The way it will destroy them, it will actually completely almost dissolve the cell, and in so doing, we can then kill the factory itself. So the opportunity here now is not to affect the virus, but the factory of the virus and prevent its depletion. And in so doing, it may induce also a memory or a vaccine, and maybe even have a dual effect of reducing the infection, killing the infected cell, and allowing the patient's own immune system to get reactivated. These are the four opportunities that now face us as strategies for the scientific community to come together and work frantically towards. Number one, blocking the receptor, preventing it from entering. Number two, destroying the machinery, preventing it from replicating. Number three, preventing from repackaging and shedding. And number four, killing the factory itself. These are opportunities that gives us hope, and I hope will provide some level of comfort that the world working together will be able to find a way to stop this virus, stop this pandemic, and learn a lot about infectious disease. I think the question that many people are asking is, how long will this pandemic last? What is the duration of the viral load in the patient? Is there any hope that this pandemic will die out? And I think it's very important for us as scientists to explain what we know and explain what we don't know. At this point, I don't think we really understand or know how long this pandemic will last. It could be months, many months. One of the earliest reports is the duration of this viral load in an infected patient lasts in a range of 35 to 37, 38 days. And whether a patient can actually reinfect himself, I think is not quite clear yet. I think the hope that this pandemic will die out I'm sure with the work of the community of scientists, we will find a way to prevent the regeneration of this particular virus. And I'm convinced that with all the community of scientists working on this disease, a vaccine will be found. But I think it's also important to dispel some myths. The question was to come up as, can I get SARS virus from my pets? Again, it's an unanswered question because there's now just been a recent report of an infected dog from Hong Kong. But the question is, could that pet reinfect humans? There's no evidence today yet that it's transmitted from pets to humans. It's a human-to-human contact. And these are the kinds of information that we will be able to say to you, we don't know. As important, I think it's important for us not to enter into conversations such as xenophobia. This is a pandemic that affects the world. This is a pandemic where the entire world working together can overcome it. The Chinese, while it started there, this now is across the entire planet, and the Chinese have put out very important scientific and clinical information. And so the concept now of xenophobia is one of the most destructive things I think we can do as it relates to public health and the opportunity for scientists to work together. The public-private relationship, the ability of governments to work together, the ability for the community to work together is so critical for us to beat this disease. I'm confident we will do that. I'm confident the science of today will enable us to do that. So with that, I'm sure we'll have questions on coronavirus, more questions on coronavirus. Please feel free to send us your questions or by email to coronavirus@latimes.com, and we'll try our best to answer them as we go through this understanding of the science behind coronavirus and try to not only allay fears, but put you in control of this disease.
It's hard to believe that something so tiny could destroy so many.
In just 2 years, this terrible plague was to claim over 20 million lives.
Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we're counting down our picks for the top 10 worst epidemics in history.
As for adults, those born before 1957 probably got the measles because there was no vaccine back then.
For this list, we're looking at plagues, pandemics, and other scourges of disease that spread through the human population like wildfire, killing millions.
The disease permanently scarred both his body and his mind.
We're not necessarily ranking them based on how many people were killed by the plagues, but those figures definitely play into our choices.
There were areas where outbreaks had occurred where the rat flea was not there to transmit, but nevertheless they had a bubonic plague outbreak.
Number 10. The third cholera pandemic.
By morning, my father was very sick. He had diarrhea that looked like gray water and poured out of him.
The unlucky victims of this disease suffered through hellish final days, with diarrhea, vomiting, and resulting dehydration being the main symptoms.
This is the emergency area where the patient first comes if the patient has severe dehydration. Severe dehydration is a medical emergency.
With the most deaths of any 19th century epidemic, the third cholera pandemic began in India and spread across Asia, Europe, North America, and Africa to countries like Russia, where over 1 million people died.
So in a matter of days, you might have 10 people infected, then 100 people, then 500 people. 1 person in 5 will get severe diarrhea. Without quick treatment, up to half of those people might die.
However, it took an outbreak of this severity for the cause of cholera to be found. In 1854, British doctor John Snow discovered that tainted water was to blame, and it was this breakthrough that eventually allowed officials to get control of the cholera pandemic.
First, we made the water safe. We filtered it through cloth and boiled it for 1 minute.
Number 9. the Asian flu pandemic of 1957.
We all missed it. The military missed it, and the World Health Organization missed it.
Though it can be confirmed that this outbreak of the influenza A virus started in China, the exact origins of the virus are contested, with one popular theory suggesting that a mutation in wild ducks joined together with a typical human strain to create the new disease. One of 3 flu pandemics during the 20th century, this one was the least deadly, with estimated global death figures ranging between 1 and 4 million. And that's likely due to the fact that a vaccine was created in 1957 that helped stem the rash of infections from this avian flu.
We had 40 million doses of vaccine by the time that the end of the year came.
Number 8, the World War I typhus epidemic.
Food was growing ever more scarce. The queues outside the bread shops stretched right down the length of the street.
Taking place during a time of incredible strife, this typhus outbreak was another devastating result of World War I, a disease caused by bacteria, whose symptoms include severe back pain and delirium. This particular outbreak originated with lice.
The perfect setup for epidemic. And then it struck. Typhus.
It was for this reason that delousing stations for the soldiers had been set up on the Western Front, which helped keep those troops healthy.
Next, the 40,000 Italians dwelling in the jam-packed air raid shelters were deloused.
However, the Eastern Front was not so lucky. By the time of its peak, between 25 and 30 million cases were reported across Soviet regions, with 3 million Russians and even more Poles and Romanians dying from infection.
In over 3 brutal years, 2,300,000 Russians had died. A further 5 million injured.
Number 7. Kokolitsli.
The Aztecs' crowning achievement was a gleaming capital city that astonished European explorers called the Venice of the New World.
This disease is categorized in a group of ailments called viral hemorrhagic fever, a family of illnesses that continues to attack humanity with viruses like Ebola.
It is in Monrovia's slums that Ebola is spreading fastest.
Affecting the Aztecs living in the region that would become Mexico twice in less than half a century, Kokolitsli decimated the population, infecting a group that was already reeling from other diseases brought to their shores by Spanish conquerors, and causing their numbers to dwindle by millions in less than a century. With symptoms that included a black tongue, dysentery, severe abdominal pain, and bleeding from your nose, eyes, and mouth, this Ebola-like epidemic annihilated what was once a thriving civilization.
The Aztec Empire had vanished, and with it, a legacy of astonishing engineering achievements.
Number 6. The Plague of Justinian.
This turns out to have been one of the most virulent pandemics in history.
A forebearer of a pandemic that will be featured later on this list, this plague is believed to have been brought to the Byzantine Empire and Constantinople specifically by infected rats traveling from Egypt on grain boats.
Some citizens blamed the plague on the Empress Theodora, saying it was a punishment from God for her sexual promiscuity.
An event that likely changed the course of European and Christian history. The Plague of Justinian left the Byzantine Empire short of healthy citizens who could act as laborers or militaries, meaning the empire was severely weakened.
Symptoms would begin with a sudden fever, followed by chills, vomiting, and an increased sensitivity to light.
With some suggesting that at its peak, the mortality rate of this plague took 5,000 lives each day. The first wave of this disease eradicated 40% of Constantinople's population and continued to kill through several more waves in the years that followed.
If the future looked bleak for Europe before, now it looked pitch black.
Number 5. The Antonine Plague. The earliest pandemic on this list, this scourge came to the Roman Empire by way of soldiers returning from fighting in Western Asia. However, what form it took is up for debate, with some thinking smallpox or measles were to blame.
Symptoms start out with coughing, runny nose, and a high fever of 104 degrees. The rash appears 3 to 5 days later.
Though it wasn't as deadly as Justinian, with only 2,000 dying in Rome per day at its pinnacle, and likely 5 million succumbing to the disease in total, The fact that it most probably claimed the lives of 2 Roman emperors, Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, served to plunge the land into fear and chaos, and likely changed the course of history.
And the emperor reaps the rewards.
The third recorded iteration of the bubonic plague, after the plague of Justinian and the Black Death. This plague ravaged the world for over a century, beginning with diseased rodents in China's Yunnan province in the 1850s, and spreading to all populated areas of the globe thanks to the world's newly established interconnection. This pandemic killed 12 million, and that was just in China and India.
The bacillus spread quickly as it moved along trade routes in the blood of infected rats. With it came the plague.
Finally ending in 1959, when death rates from the disease dropped to roughly 200 according to the World Health Organization, this third plague pandemic allowed doctors and scientists to study number 3, HIV/AIDS.
Over 50,000 men, women and children now carry the AIDS virus. That in 3 years, nearly 2,000 of us will be dead.
Theorized to have spread from primates to humans sometime in the 20th century, there was a case of an HIV-infected human in the Congo in 1959. But it wasn't until the early 1980s that the disease was detected and named in the United States, and the epidemic known as AIDS truly began to spread and define the subsequent decade.
Out there swimming, playing tennis, buffed, coming in, and we're dying. I mean, we're dead 10 days later.
Despite early ignorance that the disease was exclusive to homosexual males and intravenous drug users, AIDS attacked those who didn't take precautions indiscriminately and without mercy.
A positive diagnosis is still a life-altering experience. In Cambodia, people living with HIV are often disowned by friends, family, and the community where they live. This humiliation can be unbearable.
Fortunately, after over 30 years and over 36 million deaths, scientists have been making headway in terms of treatments and possible vaccines, although sub-Saharan Africa is still badly affected.
In Africa, there's a much higher prevalence of HIV, so your probability of it being exposed to someone who's infected is much greater.
Number 2, the 1918 flu pandemic.
It was the worst epidemic this country has ever known.
Various strains of the influenza virus have wreaked havoc on the world again and again. But there are 2 things that ensured this outbreak's inclusion. It afflicted 500 million people, killing between 50 and 100 million, and it mainly killed healthy adults.
Influenza gave you such high fever. Mother told me that I thought her black hair was a cat, and I was afraid of it with the delirium from the high fever.
Most flu viruses are dangerous for the very young, the very old, and the already weakened. But this strain of the H1N1 virus caused the immune systems of its victims to jump into overdrive and attack. And the healthier the immune system, the more violent the result.
And within a matter of months, as many as 50 million would be dead.
Affecting countries across the globe, as isolated as the Pacific Islands or the Arctic. The outbreak, nicknamed the Spanish flu, has been labeled one of history's worst natural disasters.
We still know much less than we'd like about influenza, but the experiences of the individuals who endured the pandemic of 1918 and the research into that pandemic continue to contribute to our understanding of the disease.
Before we reveal our top pick, here is an honorable, or in this case, dishonorable, mention.
The United Nations-based agency raised its pandemic flu alert to phase 6 on a 6-point scale, indicating the first flu pandemic since 1968 is underway.
Number 1, the Black Death.
Few who caught the disease ever recovered. So rapidly did it spread that it seemed one man could infect the whole world.
Peaking in the 14th century but affecting Europe until the 17th, the Black Death is thought to have killed between 75 and 200 million people, which represented roughly 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population at the time.
In just 2 years, it had swept across Western Europe, spread north over to England, and then finally to Scandinavia.
suspected by many to be a version of the bubonic plague that originated in infected rodents. This disease was most easily recognized by the tumors that covered victims' bodies. With so many dying so rapidly, bodies littered the streets as cemeteries were at capacity. While some governments attempted quarantines and some citizens turned to God for aid, there was very little that could be done to stop this infection.
Families were torn apart, villages deserted, business collapsed, states bankrupted by loss of taxes.
That doesn't even touch upon the horror of witnessing your loved one suffering or the fear that you might be next.
After the Black Death, the plague returned to haunt Europe every few decades until the mid-17th century, though never again with the ferocity of that first outbreak.
Do you agree with our list? What do you think was the worst pandemic in the world's history? For more historic top 10s published every day, be sure to subscribe to WatchMojo.com.
I told him to always wash his hands with soap and safe water after going to the toilet.